The auction block in Charleston smelled of fear and pine resin, and Solomon Adeyemi had long since learned to keep his eyes on the ground. Not because he was afraid, though fear lived in him the way marrow lives in bone, quiet and essential, but because looking men in the eye made them uncomfortable, and uncomfortable men made dangerous decisions. He had seen it happen to others. A young man named Cudjoe had looked a buyer squarely in the face once with nothing but quiet dignity, and the buyer had paid extra to have him broken before the year was out. Solomon was 23 years old. He had survived the Middle Passage at the age of 6, had survived the rice fields of Georgia, had survived the casual cruelties of 3 different masters. He understood survival as a science. He was, in all respects, that mattered, and in many that people had not yet thought to measure, a scientist. This was the problem. The man who purchased him that Tuesday morning in November was named Dr. Harlan Whitmore. He was a physician, or rather he fancied himself one, holding a certificate from a Philadelphia college that had since burned down under ambiguous circumstances. He was 61 years old, with white mutton chop whiskers and the particular self-satisfaction of a man who has never been seriously wrong about anything, because no one around him had ever been permitted to point out when he was wrong. Whitmore needed a house servant, someone strong enough to help him carry equipment, intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, and, he told his wife Martha over dinner, not the kind to cause trouble. He had paid $480 for Solomon, which was above the market rate, partly because the auctioneer had whispered something in his ear before the bidding began. This one, the auctioneer had murmured, leaning in with the conspiratorial delight of a man sharing a scandal. Reeds. Whitmore had raised his paddle. The Whitmore estate sat 12 miles outside Charleston, a white-columned house surrounded by modest grounds. Dr. Whitmore was not a plantation man. He had no appetite for the scale of agriculture, the management of dozens of souls, the paperwork of crops. He was, above all else, a man of science. Or so he believed. His study was the largest room in the house, floor to ceiling, with shelves of books and journals, a great oak desk, an armillary sphere that he had never successfully used, and in the corner, a cabinet of curiosities containing a 2-headed snake preserved in spirits, several fossils of uncertain origin, and a jar of what he claimed were genuine Egyptian artifacts, but which his wife privately suspected were river pebbles. On Solomon's first morning at the estate, Whitmore led him to this room. "You will keep this room clean," Whitmore said. "You will touch nothing on the desk. You will dust the shelves weekly, but handle the books only with the cotton gloves I will provide, and you will not read them." Solomon said nothing. "Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Solomon said. He had already read the titles on every shelf visible from where he stood. His mother had taught him to read. This is worth pausing over, because the story of how an enslaved woman in Georgia came to be literate is a story that belongs to her, not to any narrative of exceptional circumstance. Her name had been Adeola, and she had been brought from the Yoruba kingdom at the age of 14. She had learned English with startling speed, not because she was exceptional, but because she was determined, and determination in a language is simply the decision to refuse to be a stranger in it forever. She had traded a woven basket of extraordinary craftsmanship to the daughter of a neighboring family for 3 months of reading lessons. The daughter, who was 10 and bored and lonely, had agreed. Later, when the arrangement was discovered, Both parties suffered consequences, but by then, Adiola could read, and within a year of arriving on the Georgia plantation, she was reading whatever she could lay hands on: discarded newspapers, almanacs left in the barn, the backs of seed packets. When Solomon was 3, she began teaching him. When Solomon was 5.5, she died of a fever that the plantation physician did not bother to treat because she was considered too old to warrant the expense of medicine. Solomon was 6 when he crossed the Atlantic in the hold of a ship, clutching the memory of his mother's voice like a stone in his fist, and that memory included the sound of her reading aloud to him. The cadence of English sentences, the structure of argument, the way one word followed another in sequences that were not arbitrary, but built deliberately by minds that had decided the world needed saying. He never stopped. In every household, on every plantation, in every shed and field and kitchen where he had spent the years of his life, he had found ways to read. Newspapers, used as packing material, a Bible left in the barn, a manual for the maintenance of irrigation equipment, a woman's almanac discarded behind the smokehouse. He read everything, retained nearly all of it, and told no one, because telling people made them afraid. Within 2 weeks at the Whitmore estate, Solomon had done what he always did. He had made himself indispensable. He learned the names of Dr. Whitmore's instruments before Whitmore had to tell him twice. He organized the physician's supply cabinet in a manner so logical that Whitmore stood before it for several minutes one afternoon, frowning, trying to identify what was different and why it suddenly made sense. He listened, really listened, with full attention. When Whitmore dictated letters to be sent to colleagues, and twice he quietly retrieved the correct document from the cabinet before Whitmore had finished explaining which one he needed. Remarkable memory, Whitmore told his wife. He said this with a particular tone, admiring but also faintly uneasy. The tone of a man filing something under a heading he has not quite named. Martha Whitmore was a sharper woman than her husband, in the way that many women of her era were sharp, privately, invisibly, in directions that would never be recorded. She watched Solomon and saw not a remarkable memory, but a person who was organizing information with deliberate efficiency, who was, in fact, thinking. She said nothing about this to her husband, because she had learned over 30 years of marriage that pointing out what Harlan hadn't noticed tended to produce defensiveness rather than insight. She said nothing to Solomon either, but she began leaving books on the hallway table. The crisis, because there was always going to be a crisis, began in the 3rd month, with a patient named Mr. Calloway. Calloway was a merchant, 55, with a persistent chest complaint that Whitmore had been treating for 2 years with a preparation of mercury and bark. The treatment was standard for the era, accepted by the profession, and almost certainly making the patient worse. Solomon had, over the course of carrying equipment and preparing rooms, been present for 6 of Calloway's appointments. He had also in the evenings been reading the medical journals stacked on Whitmore's shelves. Not all of them. There were limits even to his speed, but enough, including a monograph published 2 years prior by a physician in Edinburgh who had been writing with considerable evidence about the toxic accumulation of mercury in long-term patients with respiratory complaints. On the 7th appointment, Calloway arrived looking worse than Solomon had ever seen him. He walked with the list to one side. His color was bad. His hands, when Solomon helped him remove his coat, were trembling in a way that had a specific quality. Not the tremor of cold or anxiety, but the tremor of something working its way through the nervous system like a slow fire. Whitmore listened to Calloway's chest, made notes, and prepared to increase the mercury preparation. Solomon, standing in the corner, where he was always standing, invisible, present, watching, said, "Sir?" Whitmore turned. His expression was not angry, not yet. It was the expression of a man encountering something that did not fit into any category he had prepared. "I am sorry to interrupt," Solomon said. He spoke carefully, the way a man walks across river ice, testing each word before placing his weight on it. The tremor in Mr. Calloway's hands, and the way he walks. I have read that these can be signs of mercury accumulation in the tissues. There is a monograph by a Dr. James Crawford of Edinburgh. The silence in the room was geological in its depth. Calloway looked at Solomon with his mouth slightly open. Whitmore looked at Solomon the way a man looks at something that has appeared in a place where it should not exist. Not with hatred initially, but with a kind of vertiginous disorientation. "That will be all," Whitmore said, very quietly. Solomon left the room. Behind him, he heard Calloway ask, "Harlan, was that—" "Never mind," Whitmore said. That evening, Whitmore came to the small room beside the kitchen where Solomon slept. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Solomon sat on his pallet and waited. There was nothing else to do. There had never been anything else to do. "Where did you read about mercury accumulation?" Whitmore asked, finally. "Your journals, sir." "I'm sorry. I know you said not to read the books." "The journals are not the books." Whitmore said this as if he were making a legal distinction. Then he was quiet again. He looked at the floor, then at the ceiling, then at some middle distance that did not exist. "Crawford's monograph. You read it?" "Yes, sir." "What else did you read?" Solomon considered. He had learned long ago that the answer to this question mattered more than almost any other. Too much, and the man across from him would feel threatened. Too little, and he would think Solomon was hiding something. Which would be worse? The issues of the American Journal of the Medical Sciences from 1843 to 1847. Mr. Beaumont's account of the stomach experiments, Dalton's work on the atomic composition of gases, parts of Mr. Darwin's account of the Beagle voyage. That was very interesting. And several almanacs because I enjoy the weather predictions and am curious about whether they are accurate over time. Whitmore sat down on the wooden stool near the door. He sat down the way old men sit when something has used up their legs, suddenly, decisively, as if the sitting were a conclusion. "How long have you been able to read?" "Since I was 3 years old, sir. My mother taught me." Another silence. Whitmore rubbed his face. "Are you telling me that Calloway's tremor is mercury poisoning?" It was not quite a question. "I think it may be worth considering, sir. I could be wrong. I am not a physician." Whitmore looked at him for a long time. His expression had moved through several stages. Shock, disorientation, something approaching anger, and then something that was harder to name. It might have been the beginning of intellectual honesty, though that was a fragile thing in a man who had spent 60 years avoiding it. "I will look at the monograph," Whitmore said. He left. 3 days later, he quietly discontinued the mercury preparation for Calloway. He substituted a preparation of digitalis for the heart component of Calloway's complaint and fresh air and walking for the rest. He wrote to Crawford in Edinburgh, requesting the full text of his research. He said nothing to Solomon about any of this, but the books on the hallway table began to include medical texts. The news spread the way news always spreads in small communities defined by rigid hierarchies, sideways through kitchens and back porches and the spaces where people stand while pretending to be doing something else. Whitmore's man corrected him on a medical case. He's not a man, He corrected him in front of a patient. Harlan Whitmore? Harlan Whitmore. It reached the other physicians in the county within a month. It reached the social circle of their wives faster than that. It reached the local newspaper editor, a Mr. Beauchamp, who was always looking for material, within 6 weeks. Beauchamp came to call on Whitmore under the pretense of a routine social visit. Over brandy in the parlor, while Martha supervised the serving of biscuits and kept her face carefully empty of opinion, Beauchamp maneuvered the conversation toward the subject of Solomon with the subtlety of a man moving furniture. "Remarkable stories one hears," he said. "People will talk," Whitmore said. "I have heard he speaks French." Solomon, who had taught himself French from a tattered grammar found in an abandoned schoolroom and could read the language fluently, if not yet speak it perfectly, was at that moment in the hallway outside, close enough to hear the conversation, but positioned in a manner that was entirely technically explainable, as standing near a table that sometimes needed attending. "He is a capable person," Whitmore said. His voice had the quality of a man holding something expensive and not being sure whether to set it down or keep holding it. "You might consider," Beauchamp said, setting his glass down, "what it means for the natural order of things." There it was, the thing that was always underneath these conversations, not fear of Solomon's intelligence itself, but fear of what that intelligence implied, about capacity, about nature, about the elaborate structure of justifications that held the world as it was currently arranged in its particular arrangement. An intelligent man could be explained away. An extraordinarily intelligent man who demonstrated it daily, who read medical journals and remembered everything and spoke without deference, and was self-evidently the intellectual equal or superior of many men who were not enslaved. This man was not an anomaly to be dismissed. He was evidence. Evidence had to be managed. "I know what you are suggesting," Whitmore said, "and I know what I have observed. I am not sure these two things are reconcilable." Beauchamp picked up his glass again. "Plenty of men have found ways to avoid reconciling them." "Yes," Whitmore said, "plenty of men." What Whitmore did next was, by the standards of his time and place, neither heroic nor sufficient. It was merely more than most men in his position chose to do, which made it notable in the small, sad arithmetic of that era. He began, carefully and without announcement, to create a paper trail. He wrote letters to colleagues in the North, to a correspondent in Boston whom he had known since medical school, and who held views considerably more progressive than the Charleston Consensus, to a Quaker organization in Philadelphia that he had heard about through channels he would not have admitted to. He described in these letters an individual of unusual intellectual gifts whose situation seemed to him, and here he used a phrase that cost him something to write, a matter of scientific and moral interest that may require further consideration. He also, more practically, began paying Solomon. Not wages, nothing so formal, nothing that could be seen. A small amount of money, placed once a month in an envelope in the room beside the kitchen, with no acknowledgement from either party. It was not enough for anything. It was also not nothing. Solomon took the money and said nothing, because the most dangerous time for a person in his position was the moment when the balance of power began, even slightly, to shift. He had seen this too. Men who moved too fast, who trusted too readily, who mistook the beginning of a change for the change itself. He waited. He read. He learned. He made himself indispensable in ways that were increasingly difficult to pretend did not require a comprehensive and disciplined intelligence. Dr. Emmett Payne came to visit in the spring. Payne was a physician from Philadelphia, passing through Charleston on his way back from a conference in New Orleans. He was 40, ambitious, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and he had read Whitmore's letters with the particular attention of a man who recognizes something important and is trying to determine how to position himself in relation to it. He arrived on a Thursday. By Saturday afternoon, he had managed to have a conversation with Solomon. It was not a planned conversation. It happened in the study when Payne came in for a book and found Solomon replacing several journals on the shelf, carefully in order, with the cotton gloves. Payne stopped. He watched for a moment, then he said in French, "Are those organized by date of publication or by subject?" Solomon turned. The question had been designed as a test, which Payne made no effort to disguise. This honesty was, in itself, something. "By date of publication within each discipline," Solomon replied in French. "Medical sciences here, natural philosophy here, mathematics and astronomy on this shelf. Within each category by date, earliest to latest." Payne was quiet for a moment. Then he switched to English. "Whitmore told me you read the Crawford monograph on mercury accumulation." "Yes." "What is your view of Crawford's methodology?" Solomon set down the journal he was holding. He looked at Payne the way he had learned to look at men who were asking him real questions, trying to determine whether the question was genuine or a trap, and also trying to determine whether the distinction mattered. He had decided, some years ago, that he would answer real questions honestly even when honesty was dangerous, because the alternative was to spend the rest of his life performing a version of himself designed to fit into a world that had already decided who he was. "His sample size is too small," Solomon said. 14 patients over 6 years. "The argument is compelling, and I believe he is correct. But the evidence is not yet sufficient to change general practice. He should have spent 3 more years collecting cases before publishing." He published early because he wanted priority, and that is understandable, but it weakened the paper. Payne sat down without being invited. He sat with the air of a man who has just been told that the room he assumed was a spare room is in fact the main room. "Where did you study?" he asked, and then immediately shook his head at himself. "Forgive me, a foolish question." "I have not studied anywhere," Solomon said. "I have read everything I could find." "What are the gaps in what you have read?" Solomon thought about this. Mathematics above the level of Euclid. "I have read Euclid twice and find it satisfying, but I have been unable to find texts on what comes after. I know there is a great deal I am missing. I have some awareness of Newton from secondary sources, but have not been able to read the Principia directly. And I have read almost nothing in languages other than English and French. I suspect there is a great deal in German that I am missing entirely." Payne stared at him. "You have read Euclid twice," Payne said. "It is a short book." "You found it satisfying." "Yes, the way a proof moves from premise to conclusion without waste. I find that satisfying in the way I imagine a skilled carpenter finds a well-joined piece of wood satisfying. The structure is entirely honest about what it is. Payne did not say anything for a long time. When he left Charleston on Monday morning, he took 3 letters with him. One was from Whitmore. One was from Solomon, written carefully and with full awareness of what it contained. A risk, a reaching out, a message in a bottle launched into a sea that might or might not return anything. And the 3rd letter was Payne's own, to the American Philosophical Society, which he had spent Sunday evening composing, and which contained a request for a meeting of certain members to discuss a matter of urgent scientific and humanitarian concern. What happened next was neither quick nor clean. History rarely offers those options. Payne spent 3 years organizing. There were men who believed that Solomon's intelligence, once demonstrated and documented, would be sufficient argument, that the evidence itself would do the work. These men were naive in the way that scientists sometimes are naive. They believed that showing people the truth obligated them to accept it. There were other men who understood that the argument was never really about evidence. The argument was about economics and power, and the elaborate architecture of a civilization that required, for its operation, a particular story about human hierarchy. Evidence that contradicted this story was not evaluated on its merits. It was managed. But there were also things that were less dramatic and perhaps more durable than either argument. The letters Solomon wrote, collected and preserved. The journals Payne began publishing about human cognitive capacity and its distribution across populations. The correspondence that accumulated between abolitionists and scientists and physicians and philosophers who had read about Solomon, or who had met him, or who had heard his name passed along in conversations like a small flame passed hand to hand in a dark room. Solomon himself, through all of this, continued working in Whitmore's study. He learned German from a grammar Payne sent him. He read Newton. He developed on paper in the evenings a series of observations about weather prediction that were, though he did not know it, methodologically similar to work being done simultaneously by a man named Fitzroy in England. He wrote it all down. He knew that the writing was important, not for him necessarily, but for what came after. He had understood from a young age that the most powerful thing a person can do is leave evidence of their thinking. It is the thing that cannot be taken back. A person can be silenced, but the record of their thoughts, if it survives, becomes its own argument. He wrote in English and French, and by 1849, in workable German. He wrote about medicine and mathematics and meteorology, and sometimes about what it was like to think in a world that had decided his thinking did not exist. He wrote, "I have noticed that men who are afraid of what they see in another person often try to make the seeing the problem. If they can convince themselves that what they observed was misinterpreted or exaggerated or anomalous, then they do not have to confront what it means. I understand this impulse. It is exhausting to have the world as you understand it contradicted by evidence. I have had this experience myself. The difference is that I have been taught, by necessity, to update my understanding when the evidence requires it. This is perhaps the only advantage of a life in which every previous assumption has already been overturned." He was 31 years old in 1855 when the legal question of his status was finally, and at ruinous cost to Payne and his associates, resolved. through a combination of purchase and legal maneuver, so complex that the men who arranged it were not entirely sure they had succeeded until it was done. He walked out of Whitmore's house on a Tuesday morning in April with a small bag, a set of papers that he would not let out of his hands, and the accumulated notebooks of 8 years of writing. Whitmore stood on the porch and watched him go. He had aged considerably in those years, and something in him had shifted. Not enough, probably, not in the ways that matter most, but shifted. Nonetheless, he had made, in his quiet way, an argument with his own life that he had never been able to make with words. "Solomon," Whitmore called. Solomon stopped, turned. "The weather observations," Whitmore said. "I believe you may be correct about the pressure patterns." Solomon looked at him for a moment. "Yes, sir," he said. "I believe so too." He turned and kept walking. He went to Philadelphia, where Payne had arranged a position at a small college newly established for students who had previously been excluded from such institutions. He was not a professor, not at first, not with the formal credentials the world required. He was a lecturer, then an instructor, then, in 1861, as the country tore itself apart around questions that had always had answers, he became the first person in the institution's history to receive a formal faculty appointment in natural sciences. His weather research was published in 1862 in a journal that initially refused to list his full name, then was persuaded to reconsider. The paper was read in London and in Berlin, and some years later was cited in a foundational text on the science of meteorology. He never stopped reading. He learned Italian in his 50s to read certain mathematical texts. He carried Euclid with him until the book fell apart, and then he had it rebound. He taught for 22 years. His students, some of whom became physicians, some teachers, some scientists, some lawyers, described him in their letters and memoirs with a consistency that crosses the distance of history cleanly, demanding, precise, patient, and capable of making any subject feel like a puzzle that was waiting, with great confidence, for you to solve it. He died in 1883 in Philadelphia in the spring. He left behind the notebooks. All of them. Every word. The notebooks are still there, for those who choose to look. Evidence, in his own hand, of a mind that was never actually a mystery. The mystery was never what he was capable of. The mystery was what it required of a civilization to see it clearly. That mystery, the notebooks suggest, he never fully solved. Neither have we.